In a week or so, the Bishop of Rome is going to visit us, and when he's in Washington, he's going to canonize Father Junipero Serra, who is considered the founder of California. In fact, this Catholic priest's statue is in the Capitol in Washington, much to a lot of people's dismay. And there's a lot of things being written about him, that he was a great persecutor of the Native American Indians of that part of the world. So I thought to myself, I better bone up on this guy because people are going to ask me questions. So I started to read a very good biography of Father Serra. And it turns out that he really wasn't a persecutor. The conquistadores, the Spanish that were coming in, they were the ones who were oppressing the Indians. He was constantly writing letters, which we still have, back to the authorities in Mexico City, protesting the treatment of the Indians, who were practically wiped out through either persecution or disease. But one of the things that came up in the writing about his early days was that when he was a young friar, a Franciscan friar, he used to scourge himself, bareback, with a whip. There was a period in Catholic history when the piety of the time insisted that if you were really serious, you inflicted punishment on yourself similar to that which Jesus suffered. Well, theologically, I think that's baloney. Because I am a firm follower of that great prophet of our last century, Sigmund Freud, who tells us that suffering comes to us in three ways. It comes from our bodies, whether it's a toothache, a broken leg, or terminal cancer. We are suffering or are going to suffer, and if we're not suffering now, we're usually anticipating what's going to happen later. At least us older folks are. Suffering also comes from external circumstances. Hurricanes, droughts, even things which look wonderful to us coming from without are causing harm to others. For instance, we're all rejoicing at the gas pump, aren't we? But a lot of people are being laid off in the refineries. So suffering is coming externally for some and bringing joy to others. But the worst suffering in life, as Freud reminds us, comes from our personal relationships with each other. The greatest pains as well as the greatest joys. But we're into pain this morning. And isn't that true? The things that have caused the most heartache and suffering for all of us at one time or another, or will, are the ruptures in human relationships. So that's where suffering comes from. So when Jesus says, if you want to be my disciple, you have to take up the cross of suffering and follow me. We have to remember that those three sources were exactly the same ones that Jesus, who we say is God, become human, voluntarily and willingly took upon himself for our sake. His body, even though we paint it up with these lovely portraits and things, went through all the sufferings that we do. He certainly suffered from external circumstances because at least he was not a wealthy man. He went through all the hardship that came from living in that part of the world at that time of history. And he certainly suffered from his relationships with others, especially the 12 that he gathered around him that we call the apostles. Peter especially. A guy who didn't get it, a guy who betrayed him, a guy who ran away from him at that last moment. You know, he sort of epitomizes all of our relationships at one time or another. So Jesus took on himself all the pain which comes from human beings, but the critical thing in his case was his response to that suffering was what is critical. Because his response saved the world. He didn't rebel, he loved. And that is why when he says, if you want to be my disciple, you have to take up your cross and respond in love as I did. We usually hear people say on Sunday, I'm going to receive communion. Well, that's also nonsense. Nobody receives communion. We take communion. We voluntarily, willingly take communion. And by doing so, we are willingly and voluntarily, deliberately uniting ourselves with Christ and his response to human suffering. That's what it means to go to Mass. That's what it means to involve ourselves in Eucharist. That's what it means to take Holy Communion. It means that I will respond this coming week to all the suffering that I will receive, whether it's the kid next door playing his radio too loud during my nap, or a discovery of a terminal disease. I will respond to that the same way that Jesus did. That's all he asks of us, to do what he did. Because in doing what he did, we are continuing his presence in the world. Someone said, to this day, Christ is being crucified, and that's a truth. He's being crucified in all the suffering of the human family, from whatever source. But he's also sharing his conquest of suffering with all of the human family through his resurrection, which we also take part in when we take communion. Thomas Aquinas says, communion is the pledge, the promise, the down payment on unending life. And so we not only take on his response to suffering, but we take on what his Father gave him in reward to that response to suffering: resurrection, unending life, glory, whatever you want to call it. And so, as I said, this is a learning time, and some of us have to relearn our catechism as we get older. We forget what it's all about. We sort of fall into the routine of the world and approach suffering the way other people do. No. We approach it by taking the cross, accepting the cross, and living and dying the cross the way Jesus did, so that we can rise with him when he returns.